Being here tonight. My name is Dean Meadows. I'm the campus minister at the Blacksburg Church of Christ, and you guessed it, Blacksburg, Virginia. And tonight's question is, what is the gospel? And the topic that, y'all know a guy by the name Mike Green? Bless your heart, right? No, I'm messing with him. I was actually just messing with Mike. I called him. I said, am I supposed to speak tonight? And he's like, Dean, you're killing me. I'm like, what? And he goes, I hear the people in the background, Dean. He's like, I'm going to give you a noogie next time I see you. So tonight's topic is, what is the gospel? And it deals with evangelism. But by a show of hands, how many people here have ever gone to an evangelism seminar at some point in their life? All right. How many people have ever had a series of lessons done in class or from the pulpit on evangelism? Okay, so everybody here knows what I'm talking about when I say evangelism. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all nations. All right? And the thing about that is, that looks a little bit different now than it did, say, 30 or 40 years ago. Anybody here think that times have changed since like 30 or 40 years ago, by a show of hands? The great prophet and poet Bob Dylan said, the times, they are a-changin', right? That's a joke. Bob Dylan's not a prophet, okay? Great songwriter, not a very good singer. Hey, it's the truth. It's the truth. All right. What do you think is different now as opposed to 30 or 40 years ago? What do you think? You're shaking your phone. Why are you shaking your phone? What do you mean?
Connection, the internet, the way technology has changed the way we interact with each other and people around the world and information.
Right. Right. So one of the biggest things that's changed in society across the world is how much access you have to so much information and to other people, right? All at the, it used to be at the tip of a keyboard. Now it's at the tip of your phone, right? And that connects us, or at least it should connect us, but in a lot of ways, it's disconnected us from people, right? Why is that? Because some people, if they're not careful, they pour all of themselves into their technology, right? What else has changed in the last 30 or 40 years? Okay, one thing's technology. What's another thing?
The length of gospel meetings.
Okay, the length of gospel meetings. What do you mean? Are they?
Back in the 50s and 60s, they would have been a week long.
It was a family affair for the whole week, right? Okay. What else? What about culture? Has culture changed in the last 30 or 40 years? Okay, how?
I don't see too many people responding when we go to their doors anymore. Come to the church when we ask them to come.
Okay, so and that's a good point. More and more people are not as religious as they used to be. All right, 25% of the American population identifies themselves as nones, N-O-N-E-S. All right, which means they are either not spiritual at all, or they simply don't identify with a particular denomination, or they say something like this. Maybe you've heard this before. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Anybody ever heard of that before? All right, and so what we're seeing in culture, and at least in our culture, Western culture, maybe even more so American culture, because over in Europe, specifically Britain, only 5% of people in Britain go to church every single Sunday. 5%. All right, 5%. And so we live now, whether you know this or not, whether you want to accept this or not, we now live in a post-Christian, post-truth society. What do I mean by that? Prior to World War II, 90% of the American population said that they believed in God. Today, that's dropped to 81%, but there's been a 7-point drop between 2017 and 2022. 7-point drop in that. The average teenager is twice as likely to be an atheist as an adult in 2022. All right? 1/3 of young people aren't sure whether or not they can know that God really does exist. And then a quarter of my generation, millennials, think that evangelism, this topic that we're going to be discussing tonight, is a bad thing. Is a bad thing. We hear things like, you live your truth, I'll live my truth, and we'll both be okay, right? It's no longer, let's talk about the truth. Let's talk about your truth, my truth, a truth, some truth. Whose truth is more truthier, right? As Stephen Colbert once said. And so we have that backdrop. And the thing about being in this place and in this time is you and I don't get to pick the culture that we evangelize to, do we? Just like the church in the first century didn't get to pick the culture that they evangelized to. And so how do we navigate evangelism in a society that is drastically less religiously oriented than it was just 70 years ago? How do we navigate evangelism when things like technology are taking over? How do we navigate evangelism when we hear things like, your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth, and, I don't care what you believe just as long as you don't bind that stuff on me? That's a little bit different conversation than we've had to have as the church over the last 30 years. But I think that there's one chapter in the Bible that gives us a roadmap to how to do that, and that's Acts chapter 17. It might be my favorite chapter in all of the Bible. So go ahead, turn over to Acts chapter 17, and we're going to navigate Paul in Athens. And we're going to look at some things that Paul does and how Paul navigates a culture that looks drastically different than his. Anybody know the culture that Paul came out of before he was a Christian? What was Paul before he was a Christian other than a killer of Christians? He's a Jew. Very good. Gold star. All right. He was a Jew, right? And so the Jewish culture is radically different than the culture in Athens. The Jews believe in one God, right? The people in Athens, the Greeks, believed in a multitude of gods. Paul believed that Yahweh was somebody that was near and close and ever active. The Greeks believed that the gods, while they were active in human events, they were way off in the distance in Mount Olympus. Okay? Paul believed that you obeyed God so that you could have a relationship with Him, so that you could please Him, and that part of the relationship with that is that God would bless Israel as Israel blessed God, whereas the Greeks believed, well, we do what the gods say so that we don't get struck by a thunderbolt from Zeus. All right? Two radically different cultures. All right? And so in Acts chapter 17, there's two words that I want you to focus on. That is the heart and center of Acts 17. And you can write these down if you want to. Connect and communicate. Connect and communicate. If you want to know how Acts 17 is summed up, it's summed up in those two words. Connect and communicate. So, before we dive in, let me ask you a question. I want you to answer. Why do you think we are scared to talk to people who aren't like us?
Fear of rejection.
Fear of rejection. I mean, who wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I like a tall glass of rejection today? And I think I'd like to go to work, I'd like to talk to my coworkers, and I'd like for them to just say, man, get out of here, I don't want anything to do with you, and I just don't want to talk to you for the rest of your life or for the rest of the day, right? Nobody wakes up and says, I'd like to be rejected by everybody that's close to me today, right? So that's one. What else? Do what? I don't know what to say. Like, I know that this person that I work with, that I go to school with, that's in my family, that I see every day because I go to the same coffee shop every day, all the time. I go to the same gas station every week. I know that they need the gospel, but I just have no idea what to say. And maybe it's, I don't even know how to start that conversation. Why? Why do we not know how to start that conversation? Because culture has ingrained to us there are two things you don't talk about in Thanksgiving and Christmas, right? What are they? Politics and religion. There you go. So it's not just Thanksgiving and Christmas. It's like every day, unless I'm around people that believe the same thing I believe, that think the same way that I think, I'm just not going to bring it up because I don't want, here's the other one, I don't want conflict. I already got enough of that. Right? I don't need that with the stranger on the side of the street. All right? And I would say that all of those are horrible reasons not to do evangelism. All of those are horrible reasons not to do evangelism. While they're in us, while that's part maybe of who we are, what we see in the New Testament, specifically with Jesus and specifically with Paul, are two dudes that are fearless for souls. Fearless for it. And the way in which they reach people is they connect with people and they communicate with people. All right? And so in Acts chapter 17, Paul is sent to Athens and he's waiting for Timothy and Silas. And notice this here. It says, now when they had passed, it's verse 16. Now when Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw a city full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Okay, so Paul is waiting for Timothy and Silas in Athens. And what takes place within his spirit? What does it say that happens to his spirit? Provoked. What does it mean to be provoked? Do what? Okay, possibly deeply troubled. What else? Stirred up. Okay. There's something that takes place, and there's this intuition to act based upon what has taken place. Now, what is provoking Paul's spirit? He's like, man, the shrimp kebab here is not as good as it is, everywhere. No, he's not saying that. What is it? Sorry. Yeah, he looks at Athens, he looks out at Athens, and he sees nothing but temples to false gods. And so he's provoked because Paul understands something that you and I can understand, or that we should understand, is that he's looking at a city that's completely and totally lost. He's looking at a group of people who think they're found, but they're not. Now, let me ask you a question here. Rhetorical. Do you see that at work? Do you see that at your neighborhood? Do you see that at school? Do you see that in areas maybe of your family, your friends? When you survey the people who are in your sphere of influence, do you just see them as coworkers, as friends, as family members? Or do you see them the way that Paul sees them? Do you see them see them as people who are lost and need the gospel? Because when you see people that way, it provokes you. Because do you think, we're going to read here in a second, just by your own understanding of Paul, do you think Paul looks at the city of Athens, is provoked in the spirit for the people there because they're lost, and says, you know what, I'm kind of scared of rejection here. What if I don't know what to say? How do I start this conversation? So what am I saying? I'm saying that when we see people as souls, not just people made up of skin, our attitude towards people changes. It provokes us. It causes us to say, I can't be quiet. All right? So he sees the idols, and then what does he do? Verse 16. Then what happens? What takes place there? Verse 17. So he did what? He reasoned. Where did he reason? That means he talked to people. Where did he go? Synagogue. Then where did he go? Marketplace. And how long did he do it? Every single day. Right? So he sees this city that's full of idols, and he doesn't sit and wait for Timothy and Silas on the dock of the bay, right? Twiddling his thumbs. He moves into the city. Why? So that he can connect with the city. 4 times between Acts chapter 15, 16, 17, and 18, it says that Paul went to the synagogue or went into the marketplace. Now, why would he go to the marketplace? We understand why he would go to the synagogue, but why the marketplace? That's full of nasty, dirty, heathen Gentiles. And that's why he went. Right? But why would he do that? Why put yourself in that position?
You don't want to help somebody that's already got it, you want to give it to them.
Right. Well, he wants to help people that need that, right? And so it's easy to understand why Paul goes to the synagogue. He goes into these marketplaces because he wants to understand the culture. And what better place to understand the culture than where everybody is? And that's the challenge that the church faces in 21st century evangelism. We have to be where everybody is. Now take a guess where everybody is. It's on your phone. It's on your phone and it's outside of these walls. All right? Anybody here ever seen The Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner? What's like the main famous line in that movie? If you build it, they will come. 50, 60 years ago, the answer for evangelism, if you build it, they'll come. If you build a building and you have gospel meetings, people will come. And that worked. I mean, you can recall the times where some of you who, I'm not going to call you old, I'll call you seasoned veterans of the church. How's that sound? All right. You can recall times where you would come for weeks, weekends, and the place would be packed and the preacher would preach and people would be convicted and people would be baptized and they become disciples. I hate to break this to you. That's not going to happen with my generation. It's just not. How do I know that? Because 4% of people 25 and younger say that they have a biblical worldview. 4% and younger in this country. 25 and younger. So what does that mean? That mean anybody understand? Anybody ever heard of Einstein's definition of insanity? What is it? If you do the same thing over and over and over again, you expect a different result. That's insanity, right? So here's my question for you all. By the way, Mike invited me, so if you don't like this, blame Mike. All right? If this congregation and congregations like this across the country don't invest in social media ministry in the area and online, it's going to be hard to reach people. What do I mean by that? And I don't know what you guys do here as far as streaming or anything like that, but if you don't have a YouTube channel, you're not going to reach people on average. I know that hurts a little bit, okay? But if you have one, then you need to pour resources into that, all right? But why? Because that is Athens. That is the marketplace of ideas. And we need to be in the marketplace of ideas, just like Paul was in Acts chapter 17. So he moves in to the marketplace, he talks to people, and something funny happens when you move into a space where people don't understand Christianity, but they need it. You get mocked. Anybody here ever had someone tell like a joke kind of mocking Christianity? How's Christianity and religion portrayed on TV? You ever notice that? I mean, where do you have the TV show that portrays the preacher as the intellect in the group? It's always the old, archaic, person that's trying to uphold the rules to people, right? And it's always the other people that are like, man, those people aren't fun, right? But notice what happens here in Acts. If I can get over to Acts. So first thing, you got to be where the people are. You have to connect with your community. All right? So whether that's online, whether it's into these neighborhoods, you and we need to be connecting with people so that we can communicate to them. Now notice here what takes place. And as he's moving through the marketplace, it says there, some of the Epicureans and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be preaching of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but in Athens, it was a really bad thing to be called a babbler, because what that meant was you're really good at saying a lot of things that don't really mean anything. Anybody ever come across people like that? Don't answer that question, okay? We've all come across people who say a lot to say a little, right? And they're essentially calling Paul a babbling fool. Now, the first thing that we have to do in evangelism is we have to connect with people. Second thing we have to do in evangelism is have to be willing to let the insult slide. Anybody here, by show of hands, ever been insulted before? If you haven't, I'd love to talk to you. All right, I want to know how that happened. And what's our first gut reaction when someone insults us or someone that we care about? What's their first gut reaction? Huh? Respond back in like a nice, kind manner, right? Like, "You are so sweet." No, what's your first? "Your mom wears combat boots," right? We say stuff like that. Why do we do that? What's up with that? Why do we do that? Okay, people don't like feeling humiliated, but you've just said something about me that I don't like, and now I've got to get even or dig the knife a little bit deeper than you dug it on me. And what does that do for evangelism? If I'm sitting down with a study and somebody says, "I really just think, what you're saying is just complete garbage. I can't believe you believe that." Our first gut instinct might be something like this: "Well, when you die, you'll probably find out." You're laughing because you've thought something like that before to somebody, or said it to somebody before, right? Well, you might not believe it now, but you will at some point. And what does that do to a study? They're like, "Where can I go to get baptized?" No, they're like, "See you later." I'll tell you a story about that real quick. I was in Colorado. We were doing it was our first campaign. We went to Tooele, Utah, which is about 20 minutes south of Salt Lake City, Utah. And if you don't know anything about Utah, the Mormons run and own Utah. All right? We were told we were going to a different country. I'm like, "We're going to Utah." He's like, "You're going to a different country." We got to Utah. I was like, "We're in a different country." And so 2 Mormon elders, quote unquote elders, wanted to have a study with us. And so we sat down with them, all 7 of us, and we hammered them for 2 hours. And I'm not just talking about the way in which they were wrong. We hammered them for 2 hours. These kids probably were between 18 and 21. And at the end of that study, I knew that we were never going to talk to them again. And someone in our group had the gall to ask, "When do you want to study again?" And they both looked at us and said, "Never." Boy, we had a story to tell. We really showed those Mormons what the Scripture said. We really stuck it to them. We got a really nice highlight reel, show to tell everybody when we get back to Colorado. But what did we just do? We just lost 2 souls. Why? Because we were offended by the things that they were saying. I have to have the ability in a study that when an insult comes or something doesn't sit well with me, I have to evaluate and ask the question, what's more important right now? Moving this study down the line or responding to this stupid insult? Too many times we're like, I need to respond to the insult with an insult. But notice what Paul does. Paul says, notice what he says. He says, they seem to be preaching foreign divinities, and Paul said, "You're all going to hell in a handbasket." What? Why are you laughing? That's not there? What? They take him to the Areopagus. Right? They take him to the place where people sit and talk about everything all day long. Now, if he'd have looked at them and said, you're an Epicurean, you're a Stoic, you're both not Christians, you're going to hell, would he have been technically right? He would have been technically right. But I bet they wouldn't have talked to him. So Paul allows the insult to slide so that he can continue the conversation. Right? We need to be able to do that. As somebody that does online apologetics and has done online debates and has called into shows before to talk to atheists, I can tell you online comment sections are brutal. But I don't care. I don't care. Why don't I care? Because what somebody says about me is less important than the person that I'm directly talking to. About the most important thing that they're ever going to need in their life. We have to be able to work at that. And I'm going to give you some strategies to do that here in a little bit. So he goes over to the Areopagus. Verse 22. And it says, so Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you've got it all wrong. I perceive in every way you're what? Very religious. Now, how do you know that? Because Because he had already connected with the community. He already where they were, and because he knew where they were, he could meet them where they are. And when you know where someone is, you can meet someone where they are, so the gospel can change who they are. That's what we need to be about. Listen, in your sphere of influence, the people that you know really, really well, you probably know more about them than anybody else in this room. Guaranteed. There are people that you work with that you know better than I will ever know them. I may never even meet them. But you know what their family dynamic is like, or at least you should. You know some of their hobbies. You know whether they're a type A person or type B person. Right? You know these things about people. And so what we need to do is we need to leverage the things we know about people to meet people where they are. That's exactly what Paul does. I can see that you are very religious. All right? You're out in the world and you say, hey, what do you think about God? Or what do you think about Christianity? Or what do you think about the afterlife? Well, I'd like to think that there's something after this life. Well, I can see that you're very religious. Or, I don't think that the afterlife exists. Well, why do you think that? Not, well, that's pretty dumb. And so notice what happens here. Something interesting happens. He says there, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with the inscription to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. All right, so what does Paul know about the Greeks? He knows that they love to build temples to idols or temples to gods, right? And the fear in the Greek society was, well, what if we miss one? What if we build all these temples and we don't build enough, or we forget a god? Well, then that God's going to be mad, and that God's going to come after us, and we don't want that God to come after us. So, to get the catch-all, they say, we'll build an altar to the unknown God. And that way, when we sacrifice to it, if we've forgotten a God, they won't be mad. And Paul makes a brilliant move. Because he knows the people, because he's connected with the people, he can now communicate with them. I saw this idol that you guys had. And it said to the unknown God, and that which you think is unknown, I now proclaim to you. And from this point, he's going to give them a gospel message. How cool is that of Paul? That's amazing. And you can do that too. You know that people in general, or most people, have some standard of right and wrong, right? Why don't you just ask somebody, why do you think that's wrong? Why do you think that's wrong? Well, I just think that it's wrong for someone to, murder somebody on the side of the street. Yeah, but why? Like, what's wrong with that? And where do you get that sense of right and wrong from? That's a great question to ask somebody. All right. And so notice, from that point on, Paul lays out to them, notice here, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. That's one strike against the Greek worldview. Because they're like, the gods need a temple. Well, if the God is God, he don't need a temple. Nor does he serve by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him. But he's actually not far from each one of us. What does he know about the Greeks? They love their temples and they think the gods are far off. What did he just say? You don't need a temple and God's near. Boom, boom. Because he knows who they are, because he knows how Greeks think, he can then poke holes in their worldview. Let me ask you a question. Do you know how the culture thinks? I'm not saying you got to live like the culture, but you got to know how the culture thinks. If we don't know, and if we don't understand, and if we don't take the time to learn how people think in society, we will never reach them. We can't. I don't need a show of hands, but let me ask you this question. How many of you have had a conversation? Answer this question for yourself. How many of you have had a conversation with somebody that's in the LGBTQ plus community in the last 24 months? We know that sex, gender, and identity is like a big thing in culture now, right? So what are we saying about the value of that soul if, one, we believe that it's wrong, and then, two, we're not willing to understand, engage, and communicate with that community? In the last 24 months, when's the last time you had a conversation with an atheist? When was the last time you had a conversation with somebody who said that they were spiritual but not religious? I would imagine that you know some of those people. But if you don't know how they think, how are you going to connect with them? How are you going to communicate with them? Because I'm here to tell you, if you walk up to the average millennial or average Gen Zer and say, you need to be a Christian because of John 3:16, they will look at you and say, how do I even know that that book's true? Do we know how to tell people how they can know that this book is true? Outside of saying, well, it's in the Bible? Guys, that's where culture is headed. That's where culture is. But notice what Paul does. Paul has the ability, because he knows who they are, he can communicate the right message to them. Notice here at this section here, he says, yeah, he's actually not far from us, for in him we live and move and have our being, and even as the Hebrew Scriptures say. Does he quote Jeremiah 31:31 right there? Wait, where's Isaiah 53 and Jeremiah 31 and Amos 2 and Joel 2 and Daniel 2? Why isn't that there? Because he knows that the Greeks don't care about Hebrew Scriptures. What do they care about? Poets. They care about their own poets. And he quotes a poet. He quotes one of their own poets, and it says, "For we are indeed his offspring." And so in quoting that poet, he then says, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think the divine being is like gold, silver, or stone, an image formed by the art of the imagination of man. For the time of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. Here it comes Jesus. Because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Do you see what Paul did? He got to Athens, he connected with the community there. Then he communicated with the community and he met them where they were. He said, you guys are very religious. You've got this unknown idol. I'm going to preach that to you. God doesn't need a temple. God doesn't need anything. God is near. He's not far. And by the way, your own poets believe this. And if your own poets believe that, then God doesn't need to be fashioned after the imagination of you. But he said a day he's going to judge everybody, and he's given us assurance by that through Jesus Christ. Do you see just the way that Paul navigates this section as he moves from where they are to where they need to be? They're over here in Greek mythology land. And notice when he brings in judgment. When does he bring in judgment? The beginning or the end of the sermon? He brings it at the end after he's deconstructed their worldview. It is so easy in evangelism to just look at people and say, well, we say this in the South, bless their heart. They're going to hell. Unless somebody talks to them. How do you know that somebody's not you? You ever thought about that? We pray and pray and pray. I pray that my cousin, I pray that my daughter, I pray that my coworker, I pray that my kid, I pray that my kid's friend. How do you know you're not an answer to your own prayer? How do you know that? Is it possible that God has placed us in this place, in this time, in this season of our lives for that exact reason? And there are three results. There are only three results that you're going to get when you do evangelism. When you connect and you communicate with people, there are three results, and we see it at the end of this section. One, people are going to mock. People have always done that. People are going to say, we want to hear more. And people are going to be converted. Now, of those three options, how many of them are good? 2. Now, I took geometry and algebra twice in high school. Okay? I ain't no math major. But if I'm looking at 3 options and 2 of them are good, why do I fear the one that's left out? More than I lean into the 2 that are positive. Maybe it's because I haven't done evangelism in a long time. I don't know how to start doing evangelism, and I'm scared to death. Now, I'm going to give you 3 things to help you get over that fear. The greatest thing that you can do in evangelism is ask questions. Okay? There's 3 questions you need to ask. The first question is, how did you get there? So, I'll give you an example. Someone comes up to you, you're talking, you're having a conversation about truth, and they said, I don't believe in absolute truth. Okay. Before we go off and say, that's the dumbest thing in the world that I've ever heard, I can't believe that you would think that, you probably learned that at university, right? Take a big deep breath and ask the question, that's interesting. How did you arrive at that conclusion? How did you get there? I was talking with a person the other day, a member of the church, thinks that LGBTQ plus lifestyle should be affirmed. And instead of blowing my stack, right, just looked at that person and said, okay, well, how'd you get there? And why do I ask that question? Because in asking that question, I'm communicating 2 things to that person. 1, I care. And 2, I care about their journey. I care about how they arrived at where they are currently. Does that make sense? Yes, no, Dean, jump off a cliff, one of those things. Yeah, so I ask, how did you get there? All right. So I don't believe in absolute truth. Okay, well, how did you get there? Well, what that allows me to do is sit back and listen. I get to exercise listening, and I get to see what's in this person's story that's contributed to them having this view. And then the next question I ask, the second question I ask is, what do you mean by that? I don't believe in absolute truth. Okay, what do you mean by absolute truth? Now, why do I ask that question? Why would I ask somebody, what do you mean by that? Right. I want to make sure that we both have the same understanding of the terms that we are talking about. I don't believe in God. Okay, well, what do you mean by God? Are we talking God of Islam? Are we talking pantheism? Are we talking Mount Olympus here? What do you mean by God, so that as we discuss, we're both on the same term? The other reason why I ask that question is because that allows me to sit back and see if this person actually knows what they're talking about. Or are they just reciting something of like a canned speech or response? All right. So first question, how did you get there? I want to know their journey. I want to know how they got from A to B. Second is clarifying statement. What do you mean by that? I think Jesus was a myth. Okay, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by myth? All right. Last question is we want to drive home the implications of their worldview. All right. So I don't believe that absolute truth exists, someone says. And you say, okay, well, how did you get there? They tell you their story. They say, okay, well, what do you mean by absolute truth? Well, I just don't think that you can know what's objectively true about anything. Last question. Well, if that's true, then, if-then question. Well, if it's true that absolute truth doesn't exist, and you just made a statement about absolute truth, is that absolutely true? See what happened? If you don't believe that absolute truth exists, and you just made a statement about truth, then is that absolutely true? So I'm driving home what the implication of their worldview is. All right? So if someone's, and that's a pretty simple one, but we need to ask those types of questions, because what that allows us to do in a passive way is to ask them the question, do you see where this leads? Do you see where this goes to? And are you willing to either ethically or intellectually die on that hill? Now, when it comes to truth, I'm not willing to go there. I'm not willing to say that absolute truth doesn't exist, because then what did I just do? I made a statement about truth, and now I have to ask the question, is that absolute? Well, I just said it. There is no absolute truth. It's a vicious circle. Okay? And so those three questions, I believe, are foundational to having good conversation. The more you can ask, like, how did you get there? What do you mean by that? Well, if that's true, then doesn't this follow? The better conversation you're going to have with somebody. All right? But that's going to require a couple things. The biggest thing it's going to require is that you be patient. Listen, patience is hard. Patience is hard. About 11 years ago, I was sitting on a cold bleacher out at First Avenue Field because my brother, who I love dearly, wanted me to watch his rugby practice. Woohoo. But being the great brother that I am, right, I sat down there on that bleacher. And along came a young lady. Her name was Kaylin. She sat next to me. She knew that I was an intern at the Piedmont Church of Christ for the youth. And she said, "Hey, Dean, you're in ministry, right?" I said, "Yes, I am." She goes, "I got a question for you." I'm like, "Yeah, what's up?" She goes, "I'm gay. Do you think that I'm going to hell?" Well, that's the first time I got that question. And at that moment, I was like, awkward, party of two, your table is ready. And I was like, well, there's two ways I can handle this. I look at her and just say, yes, have a great day. answer to that second question has a bearing on the answer to the first question that she asked. And so from that, there was an 8-week study in which we looked at who Jesus was, right? And I know I'm running out of time. I'm probably already over. Blame Mike Green. Get a hashtag, blame Mike Green. And so that led to an 8-week study. At the end of that 8-week study, she didn't become a Christian. But she said something to me that will always stick with me for a good reason and a bad reason. She said, "You're the first minister I've ever talked to that has handled the question that way. Thank you." And right after I got done, I was like, woohoo, yes, I did a good job. And then I thought to myself, I'm the only one who's ever talked to that's handled the question that way. But what was I willing to do? I was willing to connect with her and communicate. And that's what we're called to do. That doesn't mean we have to affirm everybody. We can't. The gospel calls us to not affirm sin, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't conduct ourselves in the same way that Paul did. Last question I'll ask, and I'll be done when it comes to evangelism. And it's an old-timey question that is still so relevant. If we're called to connect with people and communicate with them, we're called to meet people where they are so the gospel can change who they are, then this question is vital. For this congregation, for Blacksburg, for all the congregations across the world. If the door shuts at this place tomorrow, who in this immediate area and possibly online would care? Would it just be the people in this room? And is that good enough? Okay. Father God, thank you so much for this evening. I have thoroughly enjoyed the people here at Cawson Street Church of Christ. Father, grateful for the fact that this church exists, that this church seeks to honor you in everything that it does. Father, I pray that individually and collectively, that as we live, that we not be distracted by our immediate schedule and time hack, that if we aren't currently doing this, that we entrench ourselves in our communities, that we might connect with people, so that we might communicate with them the greatest message that's ever been communicated. That we not see people as just people knitted together by skin and muscle and bone, but we see people as souls. And that seeing people like that overwhelms and destroys our fears of rejection or not knowing what to say. That we be people who simply listen and ask questions. We meet people where they are, so that your gospel can change who they are. Father, I know that in this room, everybody here has a circle of influence